What are we going to be covering today? Today's topics, well, we're going to start with a quick note on technical guides. Yesterday's content was a little full, so I didn't have time to talk about that yesterday. Then we're going to go right into the start zone, setting up start lists and why that's important. We're going to go over call-ups for cross-country and the start order for downhill. We're going to talk about the procedures involved with those two activities. And then we're going to talk about staging and start for the downhill and call up and start for the cross-country. And we're going to finish up with a little note on working with an announcer, key person, especially at the start of the cross-country. So why are we talking about all of this? As a national commissaire, you are often the first person to intervene with the organizer before the event. You may be the only person that's there to make sure that the proper things are done to prepare for the event and that everything is present when the race starts. Organizers often simply don't know what to do, so it's up to us to make sure that they do, and you can play an important role in that. And you are always involved in international races. There's always a national college, and the national commissaire will be there before the PCP arrives, when sometimes it's too late to make changes. We also want to develop a certain consistency around the world as to how we do these things at mountain bike races. So these sessions aim to show the best way to do these things. You can work to make the race better by being proactive with the organizer. And these are simply the best ways to do most of these things. So that's why we're presenting this to all of the national commissaires who want to see it across the world. So a quick note about the technical guide. Why do we do a technical guide? The organizers must publish the special regulations, also called specific regulations, of their event in a technical guide. Why? It's to make sure that all the stakeholders know what to expect at the event. The organizer has some leeway to set certain regulations specific to their event, and it's important that they tell us what they're going to do about that. And it's also important that they don't go over the limits of what they're allowed. This guide should be published in advance. And as the PCP, if you are called on to be the PCP, you need to check that it complies with the applicable regulations, whether or not they are national or UCI. So be proactive. If you are the PCP, request the technical guide from the organizer and take a look at it well in advance of the event so you can make changes and warn the organizer of things that might not make sense in the technical guide. If you're on the panel, read it and know what's in it, because the technical guide will lay out how the event is going to be run. What should be in a technical guide? Well, there's a lot of different things. Special regulations specific to the event. At a minimum, the information in Article 1.2.039, I'm not sure if that's still the right article number, but in Section 1, it lays out what should be in the tech guide, but then there's also some specific information in the mountain bike section of the rules. In many cases, there's a range of options in the regulations. There's things that the organizer can choose to do and to change, especially at the national level. But the organizer is required to detail which options he's selecting, as well as the impact they'll have on the event and on the participants. National events can have variations in regulations and categories. It's important to lay those out. In some cases, the information in the technical guide simply confirms what's required of that type of event. I've often seen technical guides that quote sections of the rules from the UCI rulebook. That's a good way of making sure everybody remembers the rules that apply. Most important thing that you need to check is that no special regulation conflicts or goes against a UCI or a national regulation, especially if you're the PCP. Now, some of the things that go into the tech guide, I'm not going to list them all out. I'm not going to say them all. They're all here. Maybe, Andreas, we can put this up as a handout later on so people can go in and see. But there's a lot of information on this in the training guide as well. All these things are going to be necessary in a technical guide so that everybody understands what's going on. Okay, so that covers the note on technical guides. Now, finishing up with the course design that we were talking about yesterday, I figured we'd keep the start zone information with the start. So, cross-country start zones. Make sure that if there's a banner or there's an arch, that they're at least 2.5 meters above the ground, because the riders could hit it Very important. Make sure that they're straight, they're wide, and they're barriered before and after the start. The rules say 6 meters for 50 meters before the line and 6 meters for 100 meters after the line. That's a minimum. If you're running an event, a national event, for example, that has multiple categories, you're going to need more than 50 meters before the line. So make sure that you think about that and that you've been proactive with your organizer. And you also have to make sure that the first narrowing after the start allows all of the riders to get through. We don't want to have the riders bunching up and then it'd be a crash once you get to the narrowing. That's very dangerous. And make sure that it's in a flat or an uphill section. You don't want to start downhill for a cross country. Very dangerous, causes crashes. There has to be a work zone for the commissaires near the start, very important. As you can see in this one, there's a tent to the left in the picture. And make sure that all the staging areas and the boxes are all thought out properly. For a single category start, it's easy, but then once you go into multi-wave, as we see often at national events, and I'm going to talk about multi-wave all through tonight's presentation, make sure that you've thought that through because your national races often include multiple categories. So when that happens, the staging and the start zone setup are key, very important to success. There's an example on the screen now where we've divided it up into different categories. So ensure that there's enough space for all the categories in each wave. Plan space for the number of riders per category. Sometimes you'll have categories that can be 100, 150 riders, especially if you're running citizen categories in the Masters. Often a lot of riders show up for the race. Use tape to delimit the sections. We're going to talk about staging for the cross country a little bit again later on. And make sure you plan for an entry point. The worst thing that happens out of staging is that you get riders going over tape or over barriers because you haven't planned a door and you lose control. And make sure that you control access so that commissaires can check that everyone is there before the start and before the call-up. Very important for controlling who did not start and who was at the start. And then you roll up from the staging boxes in a multi-wave using volunteers and commissaires and tape. We'll talk about this again a little bit later. So some of the best practices for a cross-country start zone, make sure that there are start lines and grids for the start. Be proactive. If it's 5 minutes before the start, all the riders are already in the boxes, it's a little bit late to think about putting a start line on the ground. So make sure that you've thought that through. And for the UCI categories, we will be asking for multiple lines and possibly even grid lines so that we can line up either 6 or 8 riders per line. So make sure you've thought about that ahead of time. Make sure that there's a commissaire work area nearby the start. Sometimes organizers think that they need to keep the start completely closed, and they don't think about putting in a crossing point at the arch so that the commissaires can get back and forth or they can exit when they give the start. So make sure that you check that. Make sure that you have tape to close the start line. And remember, define who will remove it when it's time to start. Know your role as a commissaire. You may be start commissaire, you may be a different role on the panel, but helping at the start, you may be the PCP. So make sure you know where you need to be and make sure that you can get there. If the course bannering is completely closed, how do you get to the start? Think about that before the start. For staging, make sure there's enough space for all the categories and make sure that the pen size, is flexible so you can change it easily depending on what wave of the day you're working on. And plan for roll-up space. Often organizers and commissaires forget and they make the first box on the start line, which doesn't make sense. If you're going to call up riders, you need space to roll them up. So always leave that zone empty and then do your first box so you have room to bring them up so they can choose their places on the line. Remember that the back markers will fill the space quickly, so leave more space rather than less. And then use volunteers to control roll-ups. For a downhill, well, the start zone has to be covered. This is something that people often forget, by the way. Organizers put up a nice structure. They have a ramp. They put down all the non-slip. They think about everything and they forget that it needs to be covered. The commissaires and the start team are going to be there for a long time. Make sure it's free of obstacles. You're not allowed to have a jump right after the start. It has to be clear. 2 meters wide minimum. As you can see in some of those pictures, it's a lot wider than 2, but 2 is the minimum. You need non-slip surface on the structure so that the riders don't spin when they start the race. Make sure that there's a barrier or a structure for the riders to lean on. You can see in the picture that there's one on either side. That way, riders can choose to lean on the left or lean on the right. And make sure there's room for the commissaire and the timing person to stand. Again, sometimes they build the structure just wide enough for the rider. Where's the commissaire going to stand? Make sure that they think about that. I don't know how many times I've showed up to a downhill and had to have the organizer build space onto the start structure for a downhill because there's no room for the commissaire. Think about this ahead of time. Some of the best practices for the downhill start zone, make sure that there's lots of space for warm-up, and normally the warm-up space should be covered, especially if it's going to rain or if it's extremely hot. Make sure there's room for riders to circulate around the warm-up area. They're nervous, they need to walk around, they need to ride around, they need to move. And make sure there's room to form a lineup. Staging, which we refer to as whipping in downhill, you need to make sure there's room to make a lineup. If your warm-up zone is right on the start structure, there's no room to line them up. Delimit the space around the start with tape. Create a buffer zone to keep spectators and others out so that they don't bother the start commissaire and they don't ruin the concentration of the riders because they need quiet in order to focus right before their start. And it also helps the start commissaire to focus so that they don't miss a start. Very important. And make sure that you control who is in the start chute. What rider should be where when is a very important part of getting the start right for a downhill. Okay, so let's talk about start lists. Seems like a simple subject for the most part, but I continuously see where this is wrong by organizers and especially timing companies, especially if the timing company is not used to working in cycling. So let's see what everybody thinks, okay? Is it making sure all riders are in the right category? Is it ensuring no rider can start at a different place time? Does it define the call-up order? Is it for ensuring all the riders start from the start line? Or is it for establishing all riders to be included in the results? So making sure that all riders are in the right category came out as the first one, and I would agree with you. Very, very important. Good. Okay, so let's take a look. Why is it important? Well, there you go. It's used to check that all riders are in the right category at the start. It's the worst thing that can happen is that a rider in a multi-wave starts before their time, and then when you get to the end, that's almost impossible to catch because it ensures that no rider can start at a different place or a different time. So, for example, in the wrong wave. It defines the call-up order in a cross-country as well. And it defines the start order in the downhill especially, which allows you to do the whipping and the call-up. It establishes all riders to be included in the results, and it allows the identification of did not starts in cross-country. So you use the start list at the call-up to see who's there, which is very important for 80% if you're using it. And it's also important to ensure that all the riders are accounted for at the finish so we don't sit there for hours waiting for a rider who never started. What info is required on a start list? Well, the plate number and the name is the strictest minimum, right? But then we often will add the team, the start time for the category, usually at the top of the list for the cross country or for each rider for the downhill, very important for the downhill. The UCI ID at international races, the category, so often the start lists will be one category per page. The name and the date of the race is normally included in the header. And the start order. So the order of the categories for cross country or the order of the riders for the downhill. So what do they look like? Well, here's a very good example. Obviously, this is from the World Cup. Dates back to 2017, but nonetheless. So you can see this is a cross country start list. You have starter number 1. When we're at a World Cup, we often put in, if they need to be wearing a specific uniform, their plate number, the name, the team, UCI ID, their nation, and then the year of birth, their World Cup standing, their UCI standings. We'll see that for higher level races. It's not necessary when you're doing a C race or a national race, for example. For downhill, this is what you'll often see. I realize that this one is, you're not going to see detail on this one, but I just wanted to show you a full page as it goes all the way down. Here's some detail. So you're going to see the first rider to go will be rider number 116 at 2:30. There's the name, UCI ID, their team, and then their year of birth and their UCI rank, for example. Again, this being for a World Cup. So make sure that your start list is properly set up, and make sure that if it's an international race, you have the UCI ID. Remember, I've seen this even in recent years, that start lists are still including the UCI code, which was the 3-letter code for the country plus the person's birth date. This was changed because it was a privacy issue when you think about identity theft. You have the person's name and their birth date and their country of birth. Very dangerous. Make sure that you don't use this. The UCI ID is unique to each rider and is issued by the National Federation. Sometimes you're going to find conflicts. Make sure that one of the UCI IDs that was issued for that rider is on the start list. If you're working at an international race, the UCI ID is required to be able to load the results into the UCI database. So it's very, very important. It identifies the rider. It also facilitates building the call-ups from the UCI rankings, because you can use the UCI ID as a search key to find rankings when you're building the call-up list. And if you've done this before, you'll understand what I mean. It's easy to miss someone when you're looking for the rankings to build a call-up. Also, it's a control aspect. If you don't have the UCI ID on the start list, it may be because they never bought their license. Very important that every rider has their license before they start the race. And the international PCP will insist on the presence of the UCI ID on start lists and on results. Okay, who gets start lists? Normally the secretary is going to be working this. Well, commissaires need them. The announcers do too, if they're going to be able to talk about the race intelligently. Media press may be asking you for start lists, and that's fine. Team managers are entitled to get them, the organizers. Doping control will often ask you for a start list. Always important so that they can identify who is in the race. And this distribution of the start list is managed by the secretary under normal circumstances. And if you remember when we talked about in the first evenings, the first webinar, well, sometimes the secretary is the only other official at a race. Make sure that the start list gets done before the start and gets distributed if that's what you're doing at the race, okay? So, call-ups. Let's do another poll. So, why do we do call-ups? It's a privilege for performance. It's to satisfy media requirements. It's to make the start cleaner. It's to improve the show or the spectacle, or it's for safety. What do people think? Why do we do call-ups? So what are the results, Andreas? Let's see. Okay, to make the start cleaner is the first answer. Yeah, that's a good one. And then the second in importance is for safety, and the third is it's a privilege for performance. Okay, interesting answers. I don't disagree, but maybe the degree, I wouldn't have put them in the same order. So let's see. Why do we do it in the cross country? Because your start order will dramatically impact the race outcome. We want the best riders at the front of the field. It does make for a cleaner start, and it is better for the media, especially at the World Cup, for example, where the top 8 are called up last from beside the arch, and it's a privilege for performance. Your better performance gets you a better call-up. In downhill, well, start order is also a privilege, and the final rider is always the fastest because it gives them the advantage of knowing the results of everybody else before they run, and it keeps the race interesting for everybody. So, call-ups for cross-country at international races. UCI individual rankings will determine the call-up order. Even if you're doing a national race, it's probably a good idea to do it that way. UCI ranked riders are always first in order of their rank. So the highest ranked rider gets called up first, gets first choice of what happens on the line. Always do your call-ups based on registered riders. And what I mean by that is don't worry about confirmed presence. If someone's pre-registered, but you don't know yet if they're going to show up, include them in the call-ups because it's easy to skip them afterwards. It's harder to add them back if they show up at the last minute. And if they're DNS, you just skip them at call-up. It's not a big deal. So make your life easier. Make sure that your call-ups are planned ahead of time, and ideally using the full registration database. Obviously, if you have a good pre-registration or if you're doing only pre-registration, that helps, right? And you may determine who gets to be on the call-up easily by working ahead of time using the full database. Okay. Now, at international races, the rules state that we then rank randomly after we've done the UCI. But this is often where we're going to add in national series leaders, national champions, VIP riders, etc. Especially when you were doing C races that are also national series races and can be counted for national standings. We'll often bring in any of these people right after we finish the UCI ranked rider. And then lastly, we do random. And the trick is we often use registration order as random because it is in many ways. And this actually motivates the riders to register early. This is a trick that you can use because the riders start to understand that if they pre-register, they get better call-ups. So if you make that known in your country and you use that method as call-up, it motivates riders to pre-register, which makes everything easier for everybody. Now, make sure that you don't let call-up become an issue, an argument, or a problem, especially right before the start. If you have published your call-up lists beforehand, if you have held a team managers meeting where they were published, then nobody should be showing up right before the start saying that their rider should be in a different call-up position. Too late. Once you're at start, focus on start. Don't let somebody mess with your call-up. So at regional and national races, it is also a good idea to do call-up. Follow your national guidelines, your national rules, work with the national federation and the organizer to determine what you will do before you get there so that you can be clear on what's going to be happening. For example, in Canada, a lot of the races are delegated to the provincial federations. In the Quebec Provincial Federation, there is a Quebec Cup ranking, and we will rank riders based on the Quebec Cup standings. So pretty typical all over the world to do that. Okay, start order for the downhill at international races. It's very similar, but we're going to be using the rankings to determine the start order for the qualifying or the seeding. And then the UCI ranked riders go first. I often see this backwards because everybody thinks that the fastest rider goes last. True, in the finals. But make sure that for the qualifying, the fastest riders, the highest ranked riders go first because it's a privilege. They get more time to rest, especially if your qualifier and your final are on the same day. Like in the cross country, we sometimes add in national series leaders, national series champions, VIP riders, etc., but always after the UCI ranked riders, okay? So make sure that you get this right. And then the start order at the finals is the reverse order of the qualifying seeding results, meaning from the qualifying or the seeding run, the fastest rider then goes last. Now remember, there may be protected riders, for example, at a World Cup. If you're acting as a national commissary at a World Cup, someone else will be managing this, but just so you understand that there is the notion of protected riders, and all of that all revolves around seeding runs, qualifying, and where they get to be because of their ranking in the world ranking. Okay, so call-ups for downhill will determine what method, you need to determine what method you'll be used for the start order. make sure that you work with the National Federation and the organizer to determine what you will do before you get there, right? And communicating in advance to avoid arguments and discussions. There's nothing worse than working at a downhill, showing up, and the organizer has set up all of the call-ups or all of the start order for the downhill, and they've done it wrong. Because then it creates all sorts of problems because you need to do additional work to fix it, and because the riders will have been expecting it in a different way than the rules say. One of the best ways to make sure that this all happens properly is consult the technical guide and talk to the organizer ahead of time if the technical guide lays out call-up or start order in the wrong way, okay? Now, how do you get the UCI rankings? Well, if you have access to DataRide, you can get it. I find that it's actually quite heavy. It requires that you have the info ahead of time, obviously, but it's also available from the UCI website. I find that just going into the open part of the website, finding the proper ranking, and then just doing an export works the best. It's easy, and it puts it right into an Excel file that you can then sort, or you can search based on the UCI ID or the name, and it'll help you to better set up your call-up or your start order for a downhill qualifying or seating, okay? So some of the best practices that you can use for setting up your call-up in the cross country: make sure you plan ahead so the organizer can set the plate numbers as per rankings. Often, plates 1 to 10 will be reserved for the top 10 male elite riders, but you need to know that if you're going to reserve them. So it's again something that you can talk about with the organizer if you're the PCP and you're talking about the information that's going to be in their technical guide. Make sure you pull the rankings as close to the race date as possible for accuracy. Normally on the UCI site, they will tell you when the updates are coming. If you're using your national series rankings, make sure you get the most recent version. Use Excel search functions to avoid mistakes. And then publish as soon as possible to allow for corrections. You can publish your call-up if you have the database before the team managers meeting. It'll allow everybody to check it, and it'll allow you to correct mistakes before it's too late. And make sure you avoid too many discussions at team managers meetings. Single rider, a single coach raises his hand at the team managers meeting and says, "My call-up is incorrect. See me after the meeting." Don't get into that discussion at the meeting, because they're not going to have discussions about the method that you use because you've set it out ahead of time. Don't allow that argument to start. For downhill, again, plan ahead for plate numbers. Reserve the top plates for the top ranked riders. Now that means that in the finals, number 1 may not go last because they may not have qualified fastest. That's okay. You don't change the plates. You're fine. Remember also for downhill, we'll talk about this again later, downhill is 17 plus at an international race. So the juniors and the elites race together in a single category. If your national program requires you to have separate results, you can just pull them from the results, but they should be running together. You only use for seating and qualifying. Finals will then be run by qualifying time because your call-up will define normally the plate number, and you do the qualifying or the seating starting with plate number 1 and working your way down. Remember, there are protected riders at the World Cup that can change things a little bit for the start order once you get to the final. Okay, so hopefully that covered call-ups and all that kind of stuff. There's all sorts of situations that can come up in setting the start order and setting the call-ups, but if you stick to the basic principles and the rules, normally you're not going to get in trouble. And if you prepare them ahead of time and publish them, then people can point out your mistakes ahead of time. Everything works better. So, planning the starts now. So we're going to talk a little bit about scheduling start waves for the cross country, how we've set up the categories and the gaps for downhill, and when should the UCI categories be run. So cross-country start waves. Often, many categories are run in a single race day. Running one category at a time is ideal. For example, World Cup, World Championships, Olympic Games. We run the elite men, we run the elite women, then we not necessarily in that order, but we run everybody separate. The U23s, the juniors, they all have their individual start times, and we complete their race before we go to the next one. Well, that's not always possible at sea-level races or at regional national races. You're going to have a lot of people. In Canada, for example, at a Canada Cup in one of the more populous provinces, we can have up to 800 riders starting during a cross-country day in multiple waves, because the organizer is going to run national categories as well as the UCI category. So a race day schedule becomes crucial to success. You may be running up to 5 or 6 start waves in a single day. So race time becomes an important element, and the order in which you run the categories becomes very important as well. So some of the best practices, if you are running multiple start waves, plan to have equivalent categories on the course at the same time. For example, run all the youth categories together. Run all the sport and novice categories together. Run all the expert categories together. Run all the elite categories together. You don't want a men elite at a C1 race having to pass 12 and 13-year-old novice riders on their course. It just doesn't make any sense. Make sure that you group them based on their abilities and if possible, based on their age groups. Also, think about the number of riders per wave. Don't overwhelm your staging. Sometimes youth categories are very big. For example, I'm using Quebec once again because that's where I am. We have a very strong youth program. We run 9 and 10-year-olds in one race, all by themselves. 45 minutes, it's done. Then we run the 9 and 10-year-olds, and we run the 11 and the 12-year-olds in a separate race. Then we run the 13 and the 14s in a separate race. So we have 3 youth categories, each of them lasting about anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, starting at 7 o'clock in the morning, so that we can get them all off the course before we start running the quicker riders and the adult riders. For example, the novice and the sports, which will then often run as the next category. Think about the number of riders that you're going to have on the course at the same time. If you are over 200 riders on a 5-kilometer course, I submit to you that you're going to have problems because there's too many people on the race course as the packs start to distance themselves out, and you're going to have all kinds of passing going on. So try and build the race waves so that you've got an equal number of riders each time, and try and keep it a reasonable number. And then within each wave, always start the fastest riders first. That gives them a clear course out front. For example, if you're going to be running the men elite, the women elite, the junior men, and the junior women, the fastest is the men elite. They go first. Some other best practices: keep race time in mind when you're scheduling. If you run an expert master race, it's going to take 2.5 hours because of the ideal race times. You want the winner to finish in 1 hour 20 to 1 hour 40 for a master 30 to 39. But there's going to be a wide range of abilities, and you won't be running in 80%. So if it takes 1.5 hours, your last rider is going to come in 2.5 hours. If you schedule the next start before the majority of the riders of the previous one is finished, you're creating headaches for you, for timing, and for all of the organization. So the rule of thumb that we use is 80%. If your top rider is going to finish in 1 hour and 30 minutes, that's 90. Then add about 70 minutes to that for your total race time, so that you can get all of the riders off the course. And that will keep you from overlapping your starts. It'll make the race day smoother and easier to manage. Also, group your UCI categories. If you're running all your categories on the same day, and if it's a UCI Junior Series race, then you're going to have an elite start with the men and the women running together, and then you're going to have a junior start with the men and the women starting together. Ideally, you would have 4, honestly, but if you can't do that, if it's a junior series, you need to run your juniors in a separate start. If your C-level race is not a World Junior Series, then you can run all 4 categories in the same start, as long as your course is 5 to 6 kilometers long or more. Make sure that you don't overload the course. So check how many you have registered per group. So, an example of a multi-wave start schedule. This is from the Canadian Championships last year. And you can see, it's in English and in French. You can see at 9 o'clock in the morning, we were running the Canadian Challenge under 11, under 17, 11 to 12, and 13 to 16 in the citizen category. And then at 10 o'clock, we were running the under 17 cadet sport, then the minimes, the peewees, and the junior sports, and then the women. And then at 12 o'clock, we did all of the adult sport categories, so we could get those out of the way. And if I were to show you more of this, you would see that then we ran the elite categories at 1:30 or 2 o'clock, and then we ran the sport categories later on. Another example, this one is entirely in French, my apologies, but nonetheless, you can see under 11s at 8 o'clock in the morning, under 13s at 8:40, so we just left them 40 minutes to get everybody off the course. And then 50 minutes for the U13s to finish, and then at 9:30, the U15s. And then we opened it up for the next one at 11:10, where we ran all of the sports. And then midday, we ran all of the elites. And then we had the expert categories running on the same start as the elites. This was for a Quebec Cup. So that means that we didn't have as many riders as we would in a national category race. Okay, downhill start order. Downhill events are also usually run with many categories in a single race day. And the qualifications will set the start order inside a category if you run them, but in what order should you run all the categories? You're not going to run qualification for every category, by the way. So a lot of the time it's going to be based on a ranking or something like that. In international races, always the fastest category goes last. That usually means you're going to do the junior women, then the elite women, then the junior men, then the elite men, and those are combined categories. Remember, for UCI races, as I'm saying, the junior and elite are a single category. We can always extract results later if we need to put them out as separate categories for a national series, for example. In multi-category races, keep the speed of the riders in mind. Remember that the last rider of each category is normally the fastest. So that's going to help you when you start the next category, which is going to start with the slowest rider. So you start the day with the slowest categories, and typically you're going to put in time gaps. This is not between riders, this is between categories, where you're going to put in 2 to 3 minutes between age groups of the same ability. For example, as you look, sport, expert, and elite, well, within sport, you're going to start with the oldest to the youngest. So if you have a sport 50 plus, then you have a sport 40 to 49, then you have a sport 30 to 39, then you have a sport 19 to 29. You get the picture. Run them in the reverse order of their age. You run the oldest first down to the youngest. Then normally you're going to have a 5-minute gap between ability groups. So if you run all the sports with 2 or 3 minute gaps between the age groups, then you're going to take a 5-minute break before you start running the experts with a 2 to 3 minute break in between each category. And then you're going to be 10 minutes usually between the junior and elite categories so that they have plenty of time to clear course before they go. You want to avoid riders catching another rider, and you want to clear the course before another category starts. This also builds in time so you can do reruns if necessary. Okay, so typical for multi-category races, We will put this up. You'll see it in the recording. I don't want to go through all of this right now, but you're going to be doing your sports, women, sport men, expert women, expert men. Then you're going to be doing your elite categories last with longer gaps, right? Typical for a downhill start. When should the UCI categories run? Always when they're going to be seen by the most people. So for the cross country, normally we're going to be doing them midday. This also allows for the earlier categories to test the course. So you can often check to see if your race times are what you thought they were. It also leaves ample time for any issues. It's easier to delay a national category if your elite race runs long, but you don't want to delay the start of your elite. For downhill, they always run last because remember, they are the main show. Okay, so start and call up procedures for cross country. So who controls the call up for a cross country or a marathon race? Is it the organizer, the PCP, the announcer, the start commissaire, or the finish commissaire? What do we think? Let's see the results. Great, so everybody thinks it is the start commissaire is the biggest answer. Good, yep, depends on the level of the race. Okay, so let's take a look. Staging procedures for single category starts. For example, World Cup, World Championships, and all that kind of thing. We're going to have the riders in each category in staging boxes with 20 to 30 riders in each box. And they're going to be in the order of the call-up. So that start list is going to be on each of the boxes, telling them which box they should be in. And then we roll up based on that, okay? But if you're doing multi-category starts, you're going to have a lot of people. Normally what we do, we are going to group them in sections within the start straight before the line. This is where you're going to need a lot more than 50 meters, by the way. And we delimit with course tape, and we control that with commissaires or with volunteers. And then we leave the roll-up zone clear at the front. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that this is before call-up, and the start line is further up with a zone. So when we start the call-up, the riders will then roll up and choose a position on the line. The first category, usually the fastest and the most prestigious, has the most room and has the most call-up time, obviously, because you can start it early. And then each subsequent category is rolled up by volunteers who move them up using the tape to control their bringing them to where they will then be called up. So call-up happens in the gap for the other categories, so it has to be quick. At the start line, the staging lines go back 2 meters each from the start line. So we're going to put lines from the start line and then 2 meters back, another line, then 2 meters back, another line. And grid lines are strongly recommended so that you can place the riders between 80 and 100 centimeters wide. Now, this assumes a standard start procedure, not a COVID-driven one where we're going to be keeping people further apart. So assuming that by the time we get back to racing in most parts of the world, COVID situation will have improved with the inoculations. So the number per line is always determined by the PCP based on the width of the start arch. So 8 riders normally on an 8 meters, 6 on a 6, for example. And you can attempt to stop bunching before the start once you've got them into their staging. But the reality is, don't worry too much about it. Once you've given them the privilege will still be there. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Call-up procedure, it is controlled by a commissaire. At major races, it will be the TD or the UCI PCP. The riders are called to the line by the announcer, but it's not the announcer that decides, okay? Normally, they'll ride to the line, choose a grid spot, and then that's supervised by a commissaire, and you usually give 3 seconds per rider. That works best for the first call-up. Once you get into the subsequent ones, it's a little more difficult. And the announcer and the commissaires need to work out that timing together before. The goal is to finish with about 2 minutes to go before the start. For multi-category starts, you want to keep the next category back with the tape, as we said, and then you start to call up immediately after the start of the category just before. So at a local, regional, national race, the start can be given by the start commissaire or the PCP. At international races, it's always given by the PCP. And this is the method. Commissaire takes control of the PA system at 3 minutes to start. and you give a 2-minute warning, a 1-minute warning, a 30-second warning, and then a start anytime in the next 15 seconds, followed by the start. This is not done by the announcer. This is done by the commissaires who have control of the microphone. Okay, very important that you prepare for this ahead of time. Sometimes announcers resist. Important, you never do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. It's not a road race. Ideally, you use a starter pistol. If you don't have one, other options are a whistle or a horn. Last resort is go. Be careful that the riders don't see you preparing as you breathe in to do go. You have to be a little bit more ratoureux, as we say in French. Some of the best practices for the cross-country start: don't give the 15-second warning at 15 seconds. For example, if they're looking at a clock or their watch, sometimes they'll start their timer on their cycle computer when you say the 15. Always go short. After you say the 15, start the race anytime between 0 and say 12 seconds after you give that. You can say anytime in the 15 seconds, go. That's the idea, is you want to avoid false starts. But if a rider goes or jumps or flinches before you give the start, just go, fire the gun. So, and don't worry about exact start times. Sometimes, for example, the timing will want you to start exactly on time. No, they have to give what's called gun time to all of the starters if they're using transponders, which means they set the start time for each category to the same start time. They don't use the transponder crossing the map. And be careful about VIP starters. Sometimes they'll have the mayor or a government official and say, well, can that person fire the gun to start the race? Be careful. That always leads to problems. Have them stand next to you instead so that they're visible, but don't let them give the start. Bad idea, right? For downhill, obviously whipping is a very important thing. So let's see who's in charge of the start zone at the downhill, Andreas. Let's see what they think. So is it the PCP? Is it the organizer? Is it the APCP? Or is it the start commissaire? Who's in charge of the start zone at a downhill? So let's see what we got for results, Andreas. No, the start commissaire is not in charge of the start zone at the downhill. No. Okay, so let's talk about that. Downhill staging is called whipping. Means lining up the downhill riders in their proper start order based on the start list. The objective is to make sure the right rider is in the start at the right time. Now, this requires focus. It requires confidence. Needs someone with a loud voice who's able to make sure that they can get the riders in, because they can show up at the last second. It's their right, but be insistent because it creates chaos. It's made easier if your staging zone is well designed with lots of space and with a funnel into a controlled corridor for the lineup. And usually this is controlled by the APCP. The APCP controls the start zone. Very important, because they're going to control access to the zone, the whipping process. They're going to control all communications, and they're going to handle questions, issues, and complaints, because the start commissaire focuses only on giving the start. So those of you who answered that the start commissaire controls the start zone, no. We even take away the radio. We don't want them talking to anyone, because they need to focus on making sure that they do the starts all the time. And control of the start zone is very, very important in order to get a fair start for all the riders. You need to make sure it's all cordoned off with tape or barriers so that no other start rider can get to the platform before their start. You want to keep them back. You want no spectators, no coaches or media on the platform. The only exception is the coach of the rider in the chute. Then you can let them come up, but that's it. Turn down your radio volumes. Even the commissaires, sometimes we leave our radios too loud and it'll startle the rider. We want to avoid all distractions when the rider is starting in their last 15 seconds. And we want to avoid distractions for the start commissaire. Right? The start commissaire then gives the start at prescribed intervals as per the start list. And this is what they do. If the gaps between starters are more than 30 seconds, you will warn the rider 1 minute, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 10 seconds, and then in the downhill, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. And you must do this the same for all the riders, and make sure that you maintain focus if you are the starter so that you don't miss a start time. And then if you're doing manual backup, make sure that you radio down, so the APCP will do this for you if you're the starter, any gaps if the rider goes before the start go, so that you can make your backup timing as accurate as possible. Some best procedures, best practices: make sure that there's quiet in the zone, make sure the start commissaire focuses, make sure you control access to everything that's going on around that start structure. Make sure the APCP performs a ghost. What that means is if you are missing a rider, then the APCP stands in the position or designates someone to stand in the position of that rider in the start chute until that person's start time goes. First of all, to make sure there's no mistakes. Second of all, so that the next rider gets the same time as all the other riders. It would be an advantage if they're in the start chute longer. And the APCP communicates with the finish, not the start commissaire. And the APCP coordinates anything to do with course holds and anything to do with restarting, and the marshal's coordinator, not the start commissaire. This has to be done by the APCP. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. I know we're going through this a little bit quickly. We're running out of time. So just a quick note on working with an announcer. In order to work effectively with an announcer, many races have them, but their role is often misunderstood by the organizers, even by commissaires. Make sure that you're proactive in setting up how you're going to work with the announcer for call-ups, for start procedures, and for control of the microphone for the cross country. The role of the announcer is to provide color and context as well as entertainment, but they have two very important roles to play at the start of a cross country. They have to work with you to do the call-ups. So how you time it, how you do it, the content, what they say is under the control of the commissaires, not the announcer. They just execute what we want them to. So ensure they follow instructions by being proactive and by staying close. And they have to give control to the commissaires 3 minutes before the start, and make sure that they don't put on music and they don't talk until after the start. Be careful when you have multi-wave starts. Sometimes they forget this. Music is playing, first start is given, you're trying to give instructions for the second start, and they talk over you or they put on music. Make sure you plan this ahead of time. The more proactive you are with them, the better you're going to have the work done by the announcer. So, just a quick note in conclusion. If you are called on to be the national commissaire or an elite national commissaire, and you are the lead at an international race, it is your role to help make sure that everything we've talked about in these 3 webinars is as ready as possible before the UCI PCP shows up. Your role is also to support and assist the international PCP. Often that person comes from a different country, and you may need to organize interpretation or translation for the PCP if required. The organizer needs to provide this, but one of your roles is to ensure that it's done. So if you are the lead national commissaire or the lead elite national commissaire, and you can speak the official UCI language spoken by the PCP, that's even better. You also need to provide guidance on national rules and customs to the international PCP, and you may be asked to be the PCP for the national categories that are run on the same day, even if there's an elite and or junior race going on, because the international PCP will not know what your local and national rules are, okay? And you will coordinate the rest of the national commissaire team. So be proactive. Make sure you contact the PCP as soon as possible to plan and to assist for when they arrive. Contact the organizer to help them get ready. The more of the things that we've talked about over the past 3 webinars are ready ahead of time, the better. And consult with your national federation to ensure that they're cooperating, that they understand what's required. So, in summary, after these 3 hours of webinars. Being an effective national commissaire is not just about rules. I think you've probably noticed that we haven't talked a lot about rules through these 3 webinars. Effective communication is very, very important. You need to have good knowledge of how to run a mountain bike race. It's all about knowing when and where you need to be. Being an effective commissaire requires solid knowledge of race procedures and best practices. Go back over these webinars. The recordings will be available. Learn all of these things. It demands good planning and being proactive. And it requires that you have the confidence to do what works and what is right. Sometimes organizers resist. Sometimes we need to help our national federation to better understand what the requirements are for a higher level race. And make sure you keep the right attitude. Customer service is key. Know your rules, but also be a good partner to all the stakeholders at the race by knowing all of these things.